Police negotiator Rachel Martinez had never fired her weapon in the line of duty. Her colleagues whispered she was too soft, too emotional for the job. But when a gunman took 500 people hostage at Lincoln Elementary School's talent show, including dozens of children, Rachel would face the most impossible choice of her career. One bullet, one chance. 500 lives hanging in the balance. What happened next would redefine everything anyone thought they knew about courage, emotion, and the split-second decisions that separate heroes from bystanders. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The rain drummed steadily against the windows of the Riverside Police Department that Friday afternoon, creating a rhythmic backdrop to what had started as an unusually quiet shift. Detective Rachel Martinez sat at her desk, reviewing case files with the methodical precision that had earned her respect among her colleagues, even if some questioned whether she had the stomach for the more intense aspects of police work. Her dark hair was pulled back in a neat ponytail, and her brown eyes reflected the kind of thoughtfulness that made people feel heard when she spoke to them. At 32, Rachel had built her reputation on her ability to talk people down from their worst moments, to find the human connection that could diffuse even the most volatile situations. The bullpen around her buzzed with the typical Friday afternoon energy. Officers shuffled paperwork, planned their weekend activities, and counted down the hours until their shifts ended. Detective Lisa Parker, Rachel's partner of 3 years, was regaling anyone within earshot with stories from her daughter's soccer game the previous evening. The coffee maker in the corner gurgled its familiar tune, filling the air with the rich aroma that had become synonymous with long hours and late nights in pursuit of justice. Rachel's phone buzzed with a text from her sister asking about dinner plans for Sunday. She smiled softly as she typed back a response, her mind already wandering to the quiet evening she had planned. A hot bath, a good book, and maybe a glass of wine while listening to the rain continue its gentle assault on her apartment windows. It was these simple pleasures that kept her grounded in a job that often exposed her to the darkest corners of human nature. Captain James Mitchell emerged from his office, his graying hair slightly disheveled from running his hands through it, a habit he developed during his 25 years on the force. He glanced around the room with the satisfied expression of a man who knew his team was solid, dependable, and ready for whatever the weekend might throw at them. The afternoon light filtering through the station's windows cast long shadows across the worn linoleum floor, creating an almost peaceful atmosphere that belied the intensity that could erupt at any moment in their line of work. Rachel had chosen this profession not for the adrenaline or the authority, but for the moments when she could make a real difference in someone's life. She'd talked a suicidal teenager off a bridge just 2 months earlier, spent 4 hours on the phone with a domestic violence victim until the woman found the courage to leave her abuser, and negotiated the peaceful surrender of an armed robbery suspect who was high on methamphetamines and convinced the police were aliens. Her colleagues respected her success rate, but some privately wondered if her empathetic approach was sustainable in a job that often demanded swift, decisive action. The police radio crackled with routine calls throughout the afternoon. A fender bender on Oak Street, a noise complaint from the Riverside apartments, a shoplifting incident at the corner grocery store. Rachel half listened while organizing her case notes, her mind focused on the domestic violence case she'd been building for the past 3 weeks. The victim, a young mother named Jennifer, had finally agreed to testify against her ex-husband, and Rachel wanted to make sure every detail was perfect for the prosecutor. Outside, the spring rain continued its steady descent, washing the streets clean and filling the air with the fresh scent of renewal. Children would be getting out of school soon, racing home through puddles with backpacks bouncing and laughter echoing off the wet pavement. Parents would be arriving at Lincoln Elementary School for the annual spring talent show, a beloved tradition that brought the entire Riverside community together each year. The auditorium would be filled with proud families, teachers beaming with pride at their students' achievements, and the infectious energy that only comes when children are given a stage to shine. Rachel glanced at the clock on her computer screen. 2:15 in the afternoon. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. In 15 minutes, the final bell would ring at schools across Riverside, releasing students into the weekend with the kind of unbridled enthusiasm that reminded adults what pure joy looked like. She thought about her nephew Marcus, who would be performing a piano piece at his school's talent show next week. The 8-year-old had been practicing for months, his small fingers dancing across the keys with determination that both impressed and amused his family. The familiar hum of everyday police work filled the station. Officers reviewed reports, detectives followed up on leads, and the administrative staff handled the endless paperwork that kept the department functioning. It was the kind of ordinary afternoon that people in law enforcement learned to appreciate, knowing that the next call could change everything in an instant. Rachel had learned to find peace in these quiet moments, understanding that they were the foundation upon which she could build the emotional strength needed for the inevitable crises that would test every skill she developed over her 7-year career. Her desk was organized with military precision, a habit she'd inherited from her father, a retired Air Force sergeant who had taught her that attention to detail could be the difference between success and failure in any endeavor. Family photos sat beside her computer monitor, reminding her of the people who depended on her coming home safely each night. Her mother, who still worried every time Rachel left for work. Her sister, who bragged to anyone who would listen about her police officer sibling. Her nephew, who thought Aunt Rachel was the coolest person in the world because she carried a badge and helped people for a living. The afternoon light began to shift as clouds gathered more densely overhead, promising that the rain would continue well into the evening. Rachel made a mental note to grab her umbrella from the car before heading home later. She had learned to appreciate these stormy spring days in Ohio, finding something comforting about the way the rain seemed to wash away the stress and tension that accumulated during even the most routine shifts. Detective Parker finished her soccer story and wandered over to Rachel's desk, perching on the edge with the casual familiarity of a longtime partner. Lisa was everything Rachel wasn't: loud, boisterous, quick to anger, and completely unafraid of confrontation. Where Rachel sought to understand and de-escalate, Lisa preferred direct action and immediate results. Despite their different approaches, they had developed a partnership built on mutual respect and complementary skills that made them one of the most effective detective teams in the department. Their conversation drifted to weekend plans, vacation schedules, and Lisa's ongoing campaign to convince Rachel to join the department's softball team. Rachel listened with half her attention while continuing to review her case files, a multitasking skill that had served her well in a job that demanded constant vigilance and the ability to shift focus instantly when circumstances required it. The police radio continued its steady stream of routine communications, creating a familiar background soundtrack that every officer learned to filter and prioritize. Rachel's trained ear automatically sorted through the chatter, identifying which calls required immediate attention and which could be handled through normal channels. It was a skill that developed over years of experience, an unconscious ability to maintain situational awareness while focusing on the task at hand. As the clock approached 2:30, Rachel found herself thinking about the talent show at Lincoln Elementary School. The annual event was one of Riverside's most cherished traditions, drawing families from across the community to celebrate their children's creativity and courage. She remembered attending similar events when she was a child, the nervous excitement of performing in front of an audience, the pride on her parents' faces as she sang an off-key rendition of her favorite song. The rain intensified outside the station windows, creating rivulets that raced down the glass like tears on a giant's face. The sound was almost hypnotic, a natural rhythm that seemed to slow time and create a sense of suspended animation in the busy police station. Rachel allowed herself a moment to appreciate the simple beauty of the storm, understanding that these peaceful interludes were gifts to be treasured in a profession that could turn chaotic without warning. She thought about the young mother, Jennifer, who would soon face her abuser in court. Rachel had spent countless hours building trust with the woman, listening to her fears, helping her understand that she deserved better than a life lived in terror. It was cases like this that reminded Rachel why she had chosen law enforcement, why she believed that sometimes the most powerful weapon an officer could wield was compassion combined with unwavering determination to protect the innocent. Afternoons stretched on with the comfortable predictability that characterized the best shifts in police work. No major incidents, no emergency calls, just the steady rhythm of community policing that formed the backbone of public safety. Rachel appreciated these quiet days, understanding that they recharged her emotional batteries for the inevitable moments, when everything would happen at once and split-second decisions would determine outcomes that could change lives forever. As she closed another case file and reached for the next one in her stack, Rachel had no way of knowing that her phone was about to ring with a call that would test every skill she had developed, every principle she believed in, and every assumption she had made about her own capabilities under pressure. The rain continued to fall outside, washing the streets of Riverside clean while fate prepared to present one of its most challenging puzzles to a police negotiator who had built her career on the belief that violence was always the last option, never the first choice. The call came at exactly 2:47 in the afternoon, cutting through the mundane rhythm of the police station like a fire alarm in a library. Rachel was reviewing witness statements when the dispatcher's voice crackled over the radio with an urgency that made every officer in the room freeze mid-conversation. Active shooter situation at Lincoln Elementary School. Multiple hostages, armed suspect in the main auditorium. All available units respond immediately. The transformation in the station was instantaneous and electric. Chairs scraped against linoleum as officers leaped to their feet, holsters were checked, radios were grabbed, and the careful order of paperwork and routine investigations evaporated into controlled chaos. Captain Mitchell burst from his office, his face already hardened into the expression Rachel had seen him wear during the department's worst crises. Detective Parker was on her feet before the dispatcher finished speaking, her hand already reaching for her service weapon in the instinctive response of an officer trained to run toward danger when others flee from it. Rachel felt her stomach drop as the words registered fully in her mind. Lincoln Elementary School, the talent show. 500 people gathered in one place to watch children perform, now trapped with an armed individual whose intentions remained unknown but whose presence transformed the celebration into a nightmare. Her hands moved automatically to gather her equipment while her mind raced through protocols and procedures. But underneath the professional response, a deeper current of dread began to flow as she realized this was the scenario every police officer hoped never to face. The drive to Lincoln Elementary took 8 minutes that felt like hours. Rachel's unmarked sedan following a convoy of patrol cars through streets that had been washed clean by the spring rain, but now seemed ominous under the gray sky. Emergency. Lights painted the afternoon in alternating red and blue, creating a surreal atmosphere that transformed a familiar residential neighborhood into something from a disaster movie. Parents who had heard the news on radio scanners or emergency alerts were already gathering at the police perimeter, their faces etched with the particular terror that comes when your child is in danger and you are powerless to help them. The school building looked deceptively normal from the outside, its red brick facade and cheerful playground, equipment offering no hint of the crisis unfolding within its walls. Rachel had driven past Lincoln Elementary hundreds of times during her Patrols had even visited for community outreach programs, and the building had always represented safety, learning, and childhood innocence. Now those same windows seemed to stare back at her like dead eyes, hiding whatever horror was playing out in the auditorium where hundreds of families had gathered to celebrate their children's talents. Command post was being established in the school parking lot, a controlled frenzy of activity as specialized units arrived and began deploying equipment that Rachel hoped would never actually be needed. SWAT vehicles formed a protective barrier around the mobile command center, their armored bulk a stark reminder of how quickly a routine Friday afternoon had transformed into a life-or-death situation. The FBI hostage rescue team was already en route from Cincinnati, but they wouldn't arrive for at least 90 minutes, which meant local law enforcement would have to manage the crisis until federal resources could take control. David Chun, the SWAT team leader, approached Rachel with the rapid stride of a man accustomed to making critical decisions under pressure. His Kevlar vest was already strapped tight across his chest, and his eyes held the focused intensity that Rachel had seen in every elite tactical officer she'd worked with over the years. The initial reports were fragmented and confused, filtered through the terrified voices of teachers who had called 911 from hiding places throughout the school. But a picture was beginning to emerge that made Rachel's blood run cold. With each new detail, the gunman had entered the school through the main entrance during the talent show, when security protocols were relaxed to accommodate the large number of parents and family members attending the event. He had walked directly to the auditorium, where approximately 500 people were gathered to watch their children perform, including students from kindergarten through 5th grade, their parents, grandparents, siblings, and the entire teaching staff of Lincoln Elementary School. Witnesses reported that he was carrying what appeared to be an assault rifle and had blocked the main exits before anyone realized what was happening. The suspect had fired several shots into the ceiling to gain control of the room, sending the audience into immediate panic, but then had shouted for everyone to remain seated and calm. Early reports suggested he was making demands, though the specifics weren't clear because the few people who had managed to call for help were whispering from hiding places and could only relay fragments of what they were hearing. What was clear was that he had effectively trapped 500 people in a single room with no means of escape, creating exactly the kind of scenario that kept law enforcement officials awake at night with cold sweats. Rachel's radio crackled, with updates from patrol officers who were establishing a perimeter around the school and evacuating nearby houses to create a safe zone for emergency responders. The neighborhood, normally quiet on a Friday afternoon, was now swarming with police vehicles, ambulances, fire trucks, and the growing crowd of parents whose children were trapped inside the building. The scene had all the elements of every hostage negotiator's worst nightmare: a large number of victims, many of them children, an unknown suspect with unclear motivations, and a time pressure that grew more intense with each passing minute. Captain Mitchell pulled Rachel aside as she finished checking her equipment and reviewing the limited intelligence they had gathered about the school's layout. His weathered face showed the strain of command responsibility, the weight of knowing that his decisions in the next few hours could determine whether families would be reunited safely or whether Riverside would become another name on the growing list of communities devastated by mass violence. The captain had seen Rachel handle delicate negotiations before, had watched her talk armed suspects into surrendering when other officers wanted to use force, but this situation was beyond anything she had faced in her 7-year career. The school's principal, Maria Santos, had been located in the main office when the incident began and had immediately implemented lockdown procedures for the rest of the building, sealing off classrooms and ensuring that students and staff not in the auditorium were secure behind locked doors. She was now serving as the primary liaison with law enforcement, providing crucial information about the building's layout, the positioning of exits and windows, and the names of teachers and staff who might still be in the auditorium. Her voice, shook as she described the annual talent show. How excited the children had been to perform for their families. How the auditorium had been filled with laughter and applause just minutes before terror took control. The media had arrived with the speed that characterized modern news coverage, satellite trucks positioning themselves just outside the police perimeter while reporters prepared to broadcast live updates to a nation that had grown sadly accustomed to these kinds of emergencies. Rachel could see the news crews setting up their equipment, knowing that within hours, Lincoln Elementary School would be a household name and that every decision made by law enforcement would be scrutinized and analyzed by experts who had never faced the impossible choices that came with these situations. Preliminary intelligence suggested the gunman was acting alone, though SWAT teams were conducting room-by-room searches of the rest of the building to ensure no additional threats existed. The auditorium itself was a large space with limited exit points, a design feature that normally made it perfect for containing sound during performances, but now worked in the suspect's favor by limiting escape routes and making any tactical assault extremely dangerous. The building's architecture, created in an era when school security meant locking doors at night, had become a tactical nightmare in an age when threats could emerge from anywhere at any time. Rachel studied the building schematics that Principal Santos had provided, noting the positions of doors, windows, and potential entry points that SWAT might use if negotiations failed and tactical intervention became necessary. The auditorium's stage area offered some concealment opportunities, but any attempt to breach the space would require precise coordination and would put innocent lives at risk. The suspect's position near the main entrance meant he could observe most of the room while maintaining control over the primary exit, a strategic advantage that suggested either military training or careful planning. The first phone contact attempt was scheduled for 3:15, exactly 28 minutes after the initial 911 call, following protocols designed to give the suspect time to settle into a more predictable pattern while allowing law enforcement to gather intelligence and position resources. Rachel reviewed her notes on crisis negotiation techniques, focusing on the approaches that had proven most effective in previous hostage situations. But she knew that each crisis was unique and that the strategies that worked in one case might prove disastrous in another. Detective Parker approached with a tablet displaying social media feeds that were already beginning to circulate information about the incident, some accurate and some wildly speculative, all contributing to the information chaos that complicated modern crisis response. Parents were posting desperate pleas for information about their children. News outlets were broadcasting preliminary reports based on limited facts, and the usual collection of conspiracy theorists and attention seekers were already spinning elaborate theories about the suspect's motivations and government cover-ups. The spring rain had stopped, but the sky remained heavy with clouds that seemed to mirror the oppressive weight settling over everyone involved in the response. Rachel checked her watch and realized that less than an hour ago she had been thinking about quiet evenings and weekend plans, completely unaware that her most challenging professional moment was racing toward her with the inevitability of a natural disaster. The transformation from routine police work to life-or-death crisis negotiation was always jarring, but this situation carried an additional burden because of the number of innocent lives hanging in the balance. SWAT snipers were positioning themselves on nearby buildings and in the school parking lot, establishing lines of sight into the auditorium windows while remaining concealed from the suspect's view. Their role was primarily intelligence gathering at this stage, providing real-time information about the suspect's position and behavior to support the negotiation process. But everyone understood that they might become the last resort if other options failed. The weight of that possibility hung over the entire scene like a storm cloud, reminding everyone that despite their best efforts and most careful planning, some situations could only be resolved through violence. The crowd of parents continued to grow as word spread through the community. their faces showing the raw fear that comes when your child is in mortal danger, and you are reduced to waiting behind police barriers for news that might shatter your world. Rachel had worked crowd control during other emergencies, but she had never seen the particular kind of anguish that marked the faces of parents whose children were trapped with an armed gunman. Their desperation was palpable, a living thing that added pressure to an already impossible situation. Radio chatter filled the air with constant updates as various units reported their positions and status, creating a complex symphony of coordination that would continue for hours as law enforcement agencies worked together to resolve the crisis. Rachel listened to the communications while reviewing her negotiation strategy, knowing that her next conversation might determine whether 500 people would go home safely to their families or whether Riverside would join the growing list of communities forever changed by mass violence. The mobile command post was fully operational now, its banks of monitors displaying feeds from security cameras, building schematics, and communication logs that would provide real-time information to commanders making decisions that could affect hundreds of lives. Rachel had worked from similar command posts during previous incidents, but never with stakes this high and never with so many innocent children caught in the crossfire between law enforcement and an armed suspect whose motivations remained completely unknown. Principal Santos provided additional details about the talent show, explaining that the event had been running for about 30 minutes when the suspect appeared, meaning that many of the youngest children had already performed and were seated with their families in the audience. The performers still waiting backstage when the incident began had been evacuated through a rear exit by quick-thinking teachers, but the majority of students and their families remained trapped in the main auditorium. The randomness of timing meant that some families were safe while others faced unimaginable terror, a cruel lottery that would haunt the survivors long after the immediate crisis ended. Time moved differently during hostage situations, each minute stretching like an hour while simultaneously racing past with terrifying speed. Rachel knew from training and experience that the first few hours were critical, that the suspect's emotional state would be most volatile immediately after taking hostages, and that successful negotiation required establishing communication and building rapport before fear and desperation drove someone to make irreversible decisions. The clock on the command post wall showed 3:07, just 8 minutes before the scheduled first contact attempt. 8 minutes to prepare for a conversation that could determine the fate of 500 innocent people. The first phone call connected at exactly 3:15, the electronic ring cutting through the tension in the command post like a blade. Rachel held the receiver with steady hands while her heart hammered against her ribs, knowing that the next few minutes would set the tone for everything that followed. The voice that answered was rough, strained, carrying the unmistakable edge of someone operating on pure adrenaline and whatever dark motivation had driven him to transform a children's talent show into a hostage situation. Tommy Rodriguez identified himself immediately, his words tumbling out in a rush that suggested both desperation and a need to be heard that went beyond simple criminal demands. He was 34 years old, unemployed for 8 months, recently divorced, and facing eviction from his apartment in 3 days. But those basic facts only scratched the surface of whatever psychological pressure had built up inside him until it exploded into violence against innocent children and their families. Rachel's training kicked in automatically as she began the delicate process of establishing rapport with someone who held 500 lives in his hands. Her voice remained calm and steady despite the chaos swirling around the command post, where dozens of law enforcement officials monitored every word, while tactical teams positioned themselves for potential action. She knew that Tommy could hear the fear and desperation in her voice if she allowed it to show, and that any sign of weakness or insincerity could trigger the kind of escalation that would turn an already tragic situation into an unspeakable catastrophe. The conversation revealed a man who felt invisible, forgotten by a society that had promised him opportunities, but delivered only rejection and disappointment. Tommy's voice cracked as he described losing his job at the Riverside manufacturing plant when the company downsized, sending his position to Mexico along with 200 other workers who had devoted years of their lives to building automotive parts. His wife had left him 2 months later, taking their 7-year-old daughter to live with her mother in Columbus, and he hadn't been allowed to see the child since then due to a restraining order filed after a domestic dispute that he claimed was a misunderstanding. Rachel listened with the focused attention that had made her successful in previous negotiations, hearing not just the words but the pain underneath them, the accumulated grievances and frustrations that had combined into a toxic mixture of rage and despair. She could hear children crying in the background of the call, their sobs creating a heartbreaking soundtrack to Tommy's rambling monologue about injustice and abandonment. The sound of those terrified young voices added urgency to every word. Rachel spoke, reminding her that this wasn't just about understanding Tommy's psychology, but about ending the crisis before innocent lives were lost. The demands Tommy made were both specific and impossible, reflecting the confused thinking of someone who had reached the breaking point, but hadn't developed a realistic plan for what came next. He wanted his job back, his wife to return with, their daughter, the eviction notice to be canceled, and a guarantee that he would never be forgotten or overlooked again. These weren't requests that law enforcement could fulfill, but Rachel knew better than to dismiss them outright, understanding that her role was to keep Tommy talking while other options were explored, and to prevent the situation from escalating into immediate violence. As the minutes ticked by, Rachel began to piece together a psychological profile of the man holding 500 people hostage. Tommy wasn't a hardened criminal or a terrorist with a political agenda, but rather someone who had been crushed by circumstances beyond his control until he lashed out at the nearest available target. The choice of Lincoln Elementary School appeared to be random, selected simply because it offered a large gathering of innocent people who would generate the attention he craved. This randomness made the situation even more dangerous because there was no logical endpoint to his demands, no clear path to resolution that would satisfy his need for recognition and respect. The technical team monitoring the call provided real-time updates on Tommy's location within the auditorium, using voice analysis and background sounds to pinpoint his position relative to the hostages. He was moving periodically, pacing near the stage area while keeping the main entrance covered, suggesting that he understood basic tactical principles, even if he hadn't received formal training. The hostages remained seated in the auditorium chairs, with teachers and parents working together to keep the children as calm as possible under impossible circumstances. SWAT Commander David Chun approached Rachel during a brief pause in the conversation, his expression grim as he relayed intelligence gathered from the tactical teams positioned around the building. Thermal imaging showed that Tommy was carrying at least 2 weapons, possibly 3, and had positioned himself in a location that would make any assault extremely difficult without risking civilian casualties. The auditorium's design worked against law enforcement, with limited entry points and clear sight lines that would expose any tactical team to defensive fire before they could neutralize the threat. Rachel resumed the conversation with Tommy, this time focusing on his daughter and the relationship that had been severed by his divorce and subsequent legal troubles. She could hear the genuine pain in his voice when he talked about missing his child's birthday, about not being allowed to attend her school events, about feeling like he had been erased from her life by legal documents and restraining orders. This emotional vulnerability gave Rachel something to work with, a point of connection that might allow her to guide the conversation toward a peaceful resolution. The spring afternoon was giving way to evening and the media presence outside. The school had grown into a full-scale news event that would dominate television coverage across the nation. Rachel was aware of the cameras and reporters, but tried to block out the knowledge that her performance was being scrutinized by millions of viewers who had no understanding of the delicate psychological chess game being played out over the phone lines. The pressure of public attention added another layer of complexity to an already impossible situation. Tommy's voice became more agitated as the conversation continued, his demands growing more erratic and his threats more specific, he described the families around him in detail, mentioning young children by name and describing what he would do to them if his demands weren't met. Rachel fought to keep her own voice steady as she listened to these threats, knowing that any display of emotion could trigger the escalation everyone was working desperately to prevent. Her colleagues in the command post watched her face for signs of stress, ready to step in if the psychological pressure became too much for any single negotiator to handle. The first hour of the crisis stretched into the second, with Rachel maintaining almost constant communication with Tommy, while tactical teams refined their assault plans and federal reinforcements continued their journey from Cincinnati. The FBI's hostage rescue team would bring additional expertise and resources, but they were still at least 40 minutes away. And everyone understood that the situation could deteriorate rapidly if Tommy's psychological state continued to decline. During a brief break in communication, when Tommy had stepped away from the phone to address the hostages directly, Rachel consulted with Dr. Michael Thompson, the department's crisis psychologist. His assessment confirmed her own impressions. Tommy was operating in a state of extreme emotional distress, but he wasn't psychotic or completely disconnected from reality. This meant that negotiation remained possible, but it also meant that he was capable of calculated violence if he felt cornered or betrayed. The command post had become a hub of intense activity, with representatives from multiple agencies coordinating response efforts while maintaining constant communication with state and federal authorities. The governor's office was monitoring the situation closely, and the president had been briefed on the crisis, meaning that political pressure was building alongside the tactical and emotional challenges already facing the response team. Rachel tried to ignore these external pressures and focus on the only thing that mattered, maintaining the fragile connection with Tommy that might prevent this situation from ending in tragedy. When communication resumed, Tommy's voice had changed, subtly, carrying a new undertone of desperation that suggested he was beginning to understand the reality of his situation. He was trapped in the auditorium with no realistic escape plan, surrounded by law enforcement officers who would never allow him to simply walk away, facing charges that would put him in prison for the rest of his life, even if no one was hurt. This growing awareness of consequences could either motivate him to surrender or drive him to commit the ultimate act of violence against innocent victims who had done nothing to deserve their fate. Rachel shifted her approach, focusing less on Tommy's demands and more on his feelings of powerlessness and abandonment. She spoke about her own experiences with loss and disappointment, carefully sharing just enough personal information to establish genuine human connection without revealing details that could be used against her. The art of crisis negotiation required this delicate balance between professional distance and authentic empathy, and Rachel had developed the skill through years of talking people through their darkest moments. The afternoon light was fading outside the school windows, creating longer shadows that added to the ominous atmosphere surrounding the crisis. Parents continued their vigil behind the police barriers, some holding photos of their children, others clutching cell phones in hopes of receiving updates from authorities or miraculously hearing from their trapped family members. The community of Riverside had been transformed in a matter of hours from a quiet Ohio town into the center of national attention, and the residents were struggling to comprehend how their safe, familiar world had suddenly become a place where children's lives hung in the balance. Rachel's radio earpiece crackled with updates from various tactical teams, creating a constant stream of information that she had to process while maintaining her conversation with Tommy, Snipers reported no clear shot opportunities due to the suspect's positioning and the presence of hostages in the background. Entry teams had identified potential breach points, but emphasized that any assault would be extremely high risk, given the number of innocent civilians in the target area. The options for ending the crisis through force were limited and dangerous, placing additional pressure on Rachel's negotiation efforts. Tommy began to describe his military service, revealing that he had spent 2 years in the Army before receiving a medical discharge for depression and anxiety. This information explained his tactical awareness and suggested that he understood the capabilities of the law enforcement response surrounding him. Military training, even limited, had given him skills that made the situation more dangerous for everyone involved, but it also provided Rachel with another avenue for establishing connection and understanding. The conversation took an unexpected turn when Tommy mentioned his daughter's school, revealing that she attended Lincoln Elementary. Before the divorce forced her to move with her mother, he knew the building layout intimately from attending parent conferences and school events, and he had specifically chosen this location because it represented everything he had lost when his family fell apart. The auditorium where he now held hostages had been the site of his daughter's kindergarten graduation, Christmas concerts, and spring talent shows that he would never attend again. This revelation added a new dimension to the psychological profile Rachel was building, explaining why Tommy had seemed so familiar with the school's security procedures and exit routes. He wasn't a random attacker who had chosen Lincoln Elementary by chance, but rather someone returning to a place that held powerful emotional significance in his personal history. Understanding this motivation gave Rachel new tools for the negotiation, but it also revealed the depth of Tommy's psychological pain and the personal nature of his grievances against the world. The technical team intercepted a brief radio transmission from inside the auditorium, picking up a teacher's whispered communication with someone outside the immediate area. Sarah Johnson, a third-grade teacher with 15 years of experience at Lincoln Elementary, was providing information about the hostage's condition and Tommy's behavior from her position near the back of the room. Her reports confirmed that the children were terrified but unharmed, and that Tommy had not yet made any overtly threatening moves toward individual hostages. Rachel incorporated this intelligence into her conversation strategy, praising Tommy for his restraint and self-control while gradually introducing the concept that his actions were causing suffering to innocent people who had never hurt him. She spoke carefully about the children in the auditorium, describing their fear and confusion without making accusations that might trigger defensive violence. The goal was to help Tommy see the hostages as individual human beings rather than abstract symbols of the society that had rejected him. As evening approached and the crisis entered its third hour, Rachel could hear the strain in Tommy's voice growing more pronounced. He was beginning to realize that his demands couldn't be met, and that his situation was becoming more hopeless with each passing minute. This growing desperation represented the most dangerous phase of the negotiation, when someone with nothing left to lose might decide to take as many people with him as possible. Rachel knew that the next few minutes would be critical in determining whether the crisis could be resolved peacefully or whether it would end in the kind of tragedy that would haunt Riverside forever. The command post received word that the FBI hostage rescue team was now 20 minutes away, but Rachel understood that 20 minutes might as well be 20 hours if Tommy decided to act on his increasingly erratic threats. She could feel the weight of 500 lives pressing down on her shoulders as she prepared for what might be the most important conversation of her career, knowing that her next words could determine whether families would be reunited safely, or whether she would spend the rest of her life wondering what she could have done differently to prevent an unspeakable tragedy. The breakthrough came in the fourth hour, when Tommy's voice cracked completely and he began sobbing into the phone about his daughter Emily's 7th birthday party that he had missed 3 weeks earlier. Rachel seized on this moment of vulnerability. her own voice softening as she spoke about fathers and daughters, about love that persists even when circumstances tear families apart, about the kind of legacy he wanted Emily to remember when she grew up and heard this story. Tommy's defenses crumbled as Rachel painted a picture of his daughter watching news coverage years from now, trying to understand why her father had chosen to hurt innocent children instead of finding another way to deal with his pain. The emotional connection Rachel had been building for hours finally reached its target, and Tommy began to question what he was doing in a way that suggested genuine remorse rather than tactical maneuvering. He described Emily's laugh, her favorite bedtime story, the way she used to run to him when he came home from work, and Rachel could hear the profound grief of a man who had lost everything that mattered to him. She carefully guided the conversation toward the possibility of surrender, emphasizing that Emily needed a father who was alive and able to work toward rebuilding their relationship, even from prison, rather than a father who had died in a violent confrontation that would traumatize hundreds of innocent people. The negotiation reached its critical moment when Tommy suddenly stopped talking, and Rachel could hear him moving around the auditorium, his footsteps echoing in the large space while children whimpered in fear. The SWAT snipers reported that he was walking among the hostages, weapon in hand, stopping to look at individual families in a way that suggested he was making some kind of final decision. Rachel's heart raced as she realized that all her hours of careful psychological work might be unraveling in real time, that Tommy might be preparing to commit the ultimate act of violence that would destroy hundreds of lives and haunt the survivors forever. But then Tommy returned to the phone, his voice completely different now, hollow and exhausted in a way that suggested the fight had gone out of him entirely. He spoke about being tired, about wanting the pain to stop, about seeing the faces of the children around him and recognizing his own daughter in their expressions of terror. Rachel held her breath as Tommy walked through his options aloud, acknowledging that he couldn't undo what he had already done, but that he could choose how the story ended. The moment stretched endlessly as 500 people sat in terrified silence while one man wrestled with a decision that would determine their fate. Tommy's surrender came not with dramatic declarations, but with quiet exhaustion, a simple statement that he was ready to put down his weapons and walk out with his hands up. Rachel's relief was overwhelming, but her professional training kept her focused on the crucial details of managing the actual surrender process, without triggering any last-minute complications. She coordinated with the tactical teams while maintaining constant communication with Tommy, walking him through each step of the process to ensure that no misunderstandings or sudden movements would cause the situation to explode into violence. Just as it was being resolved peacefully, the moment when Tommy Rodriguez walked out of Lincoln Elementary School with his hands raised, surrounded by SWAT officers but unharmed, was captured by dozens of news cameras and broadcast live across the nation. Rachel watched from the command post as the man she had spent 4 hours getting to know was placed in handcuffs and led away, feeling an unexpected mixture of relief, exhaustion, and something that might have been sympathy for someone whose life had fallen apart so completely that he had seen terrorizing children as his only option for being heard. The evacuation of the hostages took another hour as emergency medical teams checked each person for injuries, and trauma counselors began the long process of helping children and adults process what they had experienced. Parents were reunited with their children in scenes of desperate embraces and tears of relief, while teachers like Sarah Johnson were praised for their courage in keeping students calm during the longest 4 hours of their lives. Principal Maria Santos wept openly as she hugged each of her students, knowing that while the immediate crisis was over, the psychological healing would take months or years for many of the people who had been trapped in that auditorium. Rachel found herself struggling with emotions she hadn't expected as the adrenaline of the crisis began to fade and the reality of what had almost happened began to sink in. She had successfully negotiated the peaceful resolution of a hostage situation involving 500 people, including dozens of children, without a single shot being fired or a single life lost. By any measure, it was a complete success that would be studied in law enforcement academies for years to come. But Rachel couldn't shake the image of Tommy Rodriguez's face as he was led away, or the sound of his voice when he talked about his daughter, or the realization that she had connected with him on a deeply human level that transcended the roles of negotiator and hostage-taker. Dr. Michael Thompson, the crisis psychologist, found Rachel sitting alone in her car in the school parking lot as the emergency vehicles began to disperse and the media packed up their equipment. The immediate aftermath of a major crisis was always difficult for law enforcement officers, particularly those who had carried the primary responsibility for life and death decisions, and Thompson was concerned about Rachel's emotional state as she processed what she had experienced. He sat beside her in comfortable silence for several minutes before gently asking how she was handling the transition from the intense focus of negotiation to the quiet emptiness that followed successful crisis resolution. Rachel's response surprised both Thompson and herself, as she found herself talking not about the technical aspects of the negotiation or the relief of a successful outcome, but about the moment when she had realized that Tommy Rodriguez was essentially a broken person who had lost everything that gave his life meaning. She described the strange intimacy of spending 4 hours listening to someone's deepest pain while trying to prevent him from acting on his darkest impulses, and how difficult it was to reconcile her professional satisfaction with her personal empathy for someone who had committed such a terrible act against innocent people. The debriefing sessions that followed in the days after the crisis were extensive and thorough, involving not just Rachel, but every law enforcement officer who had participated in the response. The FBI hostage rescue team, which had arrived just as Tommy was surrendering, praised the local response and particularly Rachel's negotiation skills, noting that the peaceful resolution of such a large-scale hostage situation was relatively rare and represented a textbook example of how crisis negotiation could succeed when other options had failed. Media coverage of the Lincoln Elementary hostage crisis focused heavily on Rachel's role in talking Tommy Rodriguez into surrendering peacefully, transforming her from an unknown police detective into a national symbol of the power of empathy and communication in law enforcement. Television interviews, newspaper profiles, and magazine articles explored her background and training, trying to understand what had enabled her to connect with a desperate gunman and convince him to choose life over violence. Rachel found this attention uncomfortable and tried to redirect credit to the entire response team. But the narrative of the soft-spoken negotiator who had saved 500 lives had captured public imagination in a way that couldn't be easily controlled. The letters began arriving at the Riverside Police Department within days of the crisis, thousands of them from across the country and around the world, thanking Rachel for her courage and skill in preventing what could have been one of the worst school shootings in American history. Parents wrote about their own children and how they couldn't imagine the terror of being trapped in that auditorium. Teachers described their admiration for her patient approach to someone who could have killed them all, and law enforcement officers from other jurisdictions sought her advice on crisis negotiation techniques. Tommy Rodriguez was charged with multiple felonies including kidnapping, terroristic threatening, and weapons violations, but his cooperation with authorities and the fact that no one had been physically harmed resulted in a plea agreement that would send him to prison for 15 years rather than life without parole. During his sentencing hearing, he asked to make a statement in which he thanked Rachel Martinez for helping him remember who he wanted to be rather than who his pain had made him become. The moment was carried live on television, adding another layer to a story that had already captured national attention. Rachel returned to work 2 weeks after the crisis, but found that her role within the department had fundamentally changed in ways both welcome and challenging. She was immediately assigned to lead the development of a new crisis negotiation program, that would train officers throughout Ohio in the techniques she had used at Lincoln Elementary, and she was invited to speak at law enforcement conferences across the country about the psychological aspects of hostage negotiation. The quiet detective who had preferred working cases behind the scenes suddenly found herself thrust into a leadership role that she had never sought, but couldn't responsibly avoid. The transformation in how her colleagues viewed her was subtle, but unmistakable, a new level of respect that acknowledged not just her technical skills, but her psychological courage in connecting with someone who could have killed hundreds of innocent people. Detective Lisa Parker, her longtime partner, joked that Rachel had become the department's secret weapon, but the joke carried an undertone of genuine awe for what she had accomplished under impossible pressure. Captain Mitchell recommended her for promotion to lieutenant, a recognition of both her performance during the crisis and her potential to lead other officers through similar challenges. 6 months after the Lincoln Elementary crisis, Rachel received an unexpected phone call from Emily Rodriguez, Tommy's 7-year-old daughter, who had been allowed to speak with her as part of a therapeutic process designed to help the child understand what had happened to her father. Emily's voice was small and shy as she thanked Rachel for helping her daddy remember that he loved her, even when he was very sad and angry about other things. The conversation lasted only a few minutes, but it provided Rachel with a sense of closure that she hadn't realized she needed. Confirmation that her decision to treat Tommy as a human being rather than simply a threat had been the right choice. The annual Lincoln Elementary Spring Talent Show resumed the following year, with enhanced security measures, but also with a determination not to let fear destroy a tradition that brought the community together. Rachel was invited to attend as an honored guest, and she watched from the same auditorium where she had spent 4 hours on the phone trying to prevent tragedy, now filled once again with children's laughter and parents' applause. Principal Maria Santos introduced her to the audience as the person who had saved their school, but Rachel felt uncomfortable with the hero narrative, preferring to think of herself as someone who had simply done her job with the best of her ability during an impossible situation. The Lincoln Elementary crisis became a case study in law enforcement academies across the country, used to teach new officers about the importance of empathy and communication in police work. Rachel was frequently asked to lecture about the techniques she had used, but she always emphasized that the real lesson wasn't about any specific negotiation strategy, but about the fundamental importance of seeing suspects as human beings rather than simply threats to be neutralized. Her approach had worked not because she had followed a particular protocol, but because she had been willing to genuinely listen to Tommy Rodriguez's pain and help him find a way to end the crisis without destroying more lives. The psychological impact of the crisis stayed with Rachel long after the media attention faded and the department returned to normal operations. She continued to work as a detective and crisis negotiator, but she found herself approaching every case with a deeper understanding of how quickly someone's life could spiral out of control and how important it was for law enforcement to respond with both strength and compassion. The image of Tommy Rodriguez walking out of the school with his hands up remained vivid in her memory, not as a symbol of victory over evil, but as a reminder that even in the darkest moments, people could choose to step back from violence if someone was willing to help them find another way. 3 years after the crisis, Rachel was promoted to captain and placed in charge of the department's crisis intervention unit, a new division created specifically to handle situations involving mental health emergencies and potential violence. Her experiences at Lincoln Elementary had convinced department leadership that traditional law enforcement approaches weren't always sufficient for dealing with people in psychological crisis, and Rachel's success had demonstrated the value of combining tactical readiness with psychological expertise. The legacy of the Lincoln Elementary hostage crisis extended far beyond Rachel's individual career. influencing how police departments across Ohio and eventually across the nation approached crisis negotiation and mental health emergencies. Training programs were developed based on Rachel's techniques, emphasizing the importance of empathy and human connection in addition to tactical preparedness. The case became a model for how law enforcement could successfully resolve dangerous situations through communication rather than force, though everyone involved understood that such outcomes required both skill and favorable circumstances that weren't always present. Tommy Rodriguez served his sentence at the Chillicothe Correctional Institution, where he participated in mental health programs and earned his GED while working in the prison library. He maintained regular correspondence with Emily, who visited him twice a year with her mother's permission, slowly rebuilding a relationship that had been shattered by his actions, but not completely destroyed. In his letters to Rachel, which she answered occasionally, he described his efforts to understand what had driven him to threaten innocent children and his determination to become someone his daughter could eventually forgive and perhaps even respect. Rachel Martinez never fired her weapon during the Lincoln Elementary crisis, and in fact never fired her service weapon in the line of duty throughout her entire career with the Riverside Police Department. Her colleagues' early concerns about whether she was too emotional for police work proved to be completely wrong, as her ability to connect with people in crisis became her greatest professional asset. The young detective who had once been questioned for her soft approach to law enforcement became a national example of how empathy and communication could succeed where force and intimidation might have failed catastrophically. The story of the Lincoln Elementary hostage crisis was eventually turned into a documentary film that aired on national television, featuring interviews with Rachel, Principal Santos, some of the teachers and parents who had been trapped in the auditorium, and even Tommy Rodriguez speaking from prison about his mental state during the crisis and his gratitude for Rachel's patient approach to helping him find a way out of the situation he had created. The film emphasized themes of redemption, forgiveness, and the power of human connection to overcome even the most desperate circumstances. Rachel retired from the Riverside Police Department after 25 years of service, having established herself as one of the most respected crisis negotiators in the country. Her techniques were taught in police academies, her approach was studied by psychologists and criminologists, and her success at Lincoln Elementary remained the gold standard for peaceful resolution of large-scale hostage situations. But for Rachel herself, the true measure of success wasn't the awards or recognition she received, but the knowledge that 500 people had gone home safely to their families because she had been willing to listen with both her professional skills and her human heart to someone whose life had fallen apart so completely that violence had seemed like his only option for being heard. Years later, when young police officers asked Rachel for advice about crisis negotiation, she would tell them that the most important tool they could develop wasn't any specific technique or protocol, but the ability to remember that even in the most dangerous situations, they were dealing with human beings who had stories and feelings and reasons for their actions that might not make sense to others but were completely real to them. The lesson of Lincoln Elementary wasn't that empathy could solve every problem or that communication could always prevent violence, but that sometimes the difference between tragedy and triumph came down to one person's willingness to see beyond the immediate threat and connect with the humanity that existed even in the darkest circumstances. Tommy Rodriguez was released from prison after serving 12 years of his sentence, having demonstrated genuine rehabilitation and posing no threat to public safety, according to psychological evaluations. He moved to a small town in southern Ohio where he worked as a maintenance supervisor at a community college and volunteered with a program that helped other men dealing with divorce and unemployment. He never contacted any of the families who had been in the auditorium that day, understanding that his presence would be a painful reminder of the worst day of their lives. But he did continue to write occasional letters to Rachel, updating her on his progress and expressing gratitude for helping him choose life over death when he had been too lost to see any other options. Emily Rodriguez graduated from high school with honors and went on to study psychology at Ohio State University. Inspired by her own experiences and her father's story to pursue a career helping people in crisis. She never publicly discussed her father's actions or her relationship with him, preferring to let her work speak for itself. But those who knew her story understood that her compassion and insight had been shaped by growing up with the knowledge that people could change, that mistakes didn't have to define someone forever, and that sometimes the most important thing one person could do for another was simply to listen and care, enough to help them find a better way forward. The morning sun cast long shadows across the campus of the National Crisis Negotiation Institute in Quantico, Virginia, where Rachel Martinez walked through the halls she had helped design, 20 years after the Lincoln Elementary hostage crisis that had changed her life forever. At 52, her hair showed streaks of silver, and her face carried the lines that came from 2 decades of looking into the darkest corners of human desperation. But her eyes still held the same compassionate intelligence that had convinced Tommy Rodriguez to choose life over death on that rainy Friday afternoon in Riverside, Ohio. The Institute had become the premier training facility for crisis negotiators from around the world, built on the foundation of Rachel's revolutionary approach that emphasized psychological connection over tactical intimidation. Students from police departments across America, military units from allied nations, and even corporate security specialists came to learn the techniques that had proven successful in hundreds of high-stakes situations since that first breakthrough at Lincoln Elementary. The building itself was a testament to how far the field had evolved, with state-of-the-art simulation rooms, psychological research laboratories, and a memorial wall honoring negotiators who had lost their lives in the line of duty. Rachel's morning routine included a walk through the memorial garden that had been dedicated 5 years earlier, pausing at the bench inscribed with the names of the 500 hostages from Lincoln Elementary School. The garden wasn't a monument to tragedy, but to transformation, representing how a community had chosen healing over hatred and how individual courage could inspire systemic change that rippled outward for generations. Fresh flowers appeared regularly on the bench, left by visitors who understood that this quiet spot represented something larger than any single incident. The day's schedule included a lecture to a group of international students about the psychological dynamics of mass hostage situations, but Rachel's mind was focused on a phone call she had received the previous evening from Emily Rodriguez. Now Dr. Emily Rodriguez, who worked as a crisis intervention specialist at Children's Hospital in Columbus. Emily's voice still carried echoes of the 7-year-old girl who had called to thank Rachel for helping her father, but it now held the professional confidence of someone who had dedicated her life to helping families navigate their darkest moments. Emily's call had been to inform Rachel that Tommy Rodriguez had passed away peacefully in his sleep at the age of 67, 12 years after his release from prison and 25 years after the day that had defined all their lives. He had lived quietly in the small town of Millfield, working steadily and attending counseling sessions until the end, never again showing any signs of the desperation that had driven him to threaten innocent children. His death had been noted only in a brief obituary that mentioned his work with troubled veterans and his volunteer service at a local food bank, making no reference to the events that had once made him a household name. The funeral had been small and private, attended by Emily, her mother, a few co-workers from the community college where Tommy had worked for over a decade, and several men from his veteran support group who had found hope in his story of redemption and recovery. Emily had asked Rachel to attend, not as the police negotiator who had talked her father into surrendering, but as someone who had seen him as a human being worthy of salvation, even in his darkest moment. Rachel had driven the 4 hours from Quantico to Ohio without hesitation, understanding that her presence would provide closure not just for Emily, but for herself as well. The service had been held at a small Methodist church where Tommy had attended services regularly for the past 8 years, having found faith through the prison chaplain, who had helped him understand that forgiveness was possible even for someone who had committed unforgivable acts. The pastor spoke about redemption, about second chances, and about how even the most broken people could find purpose if someone was willing to see beyond their worst moments. Rachel had sat in the back pew, listening to stories about a man who had volunteered to read to children at the local library, who had helped build a playground for disadvantaged families, and who had spent his final years trying to add more good to the world than harm. During the graveside service, Emily had approached Rachel with tears in her eyes, thanking her not just for saving her father's life that day at Lincoln Elementary, but for showing him that he could choose to be better than his worst impulses. She described the letters Tommy had written to her throughout his imprisonment and after his release, letters that documented his journey from despair to acceptance to genuine hope for the future. He had never asked for forgiveness from the families. He had terrorized, understanding that such forgiveness wasn't his to request, but he had worked every day to earn the right to be called Emily's father again. The conversation with Emily had reminded Rachel of why she had dedicated her career to crisis negotiation, not for the adrenaline of high-stakes situations or the recognition that came with successful outcomes, but for moments like these when she could see the long-term impact of choosing empathy over force. Tommy Rodriguez had been one man whose life had spiraled into violence, but the approach that had saved him had been refined and applied to thousands of other situations over the past 2 decades, preventing countless tragedies that would never make headlines because they had been resolved before they could escalate. Rachel's office at the Institute was lined with case files from successful negotiations, each representing a situation where communication had triumphed over violence, where someone in crisis had been given the opportunity to step back from the edge instead of being pushed over it. The techniques developed at Lincoln Elementary had been adapted for everything from domestic disputes to international terrorism incidents, proving that the fundamental human need to be heard and understood, transcended cultural boundaries and individual circumstances. The morning lecture focused on the psychological profile of mass hostage takers, using Tommy Rodriguez as a case study while carefully protecting the privacy of all involved parties. Rachel had learned to discuss the case clinically while never losing sight of the human cost of such situations, helping her students understand that successful negotiation required both professional skill and genuine emotional intelligence. The international students asked thoughtful questions about cultural differences in crisis response, about the role of mental health support in law enforcement, and about how to maintain empathy for someone who posed a threat to innocent lives. During the lunch break, Rachel received a visit from David Chun, the former SWAT commander who had led the tactical response at Lincoln Elementary, and who now served as the Institute's director of operations. David had become one of Rachel's closest friends over the years, their partnership during that crisis having evolved into a mutual respect that had shaped both of their careers. He brought news that the Riverside Police Department was planning a 25th anniversary commemoration of the Lincoln Elementary incident, focusing not on the crisis itself, but on the community healing and policy changes that had followed. The commemoration would include the dedication of a new crisis intervention center that would provide mental health services to people in emotional distress before their situations escalated to the point where law enforcement involvement became necessary. The center was being funded through a combination of federal grants and private donations, including a substantial contribution from the Tommy Rodriguez Memorial Fund that Emily had established to support programs helping troubled veterans and their families. The irony wasn't lost on anyone involved that the man who had once terrorized a community was now helping to fund services that might prevent others from following his path. Rachel agreed to speak at the dedication ceremony, understanding that her presence would help demonstrate how far the community had come in the quarter century since that frightening Friday afternoon. The invitation represented more than just recognition of her role in resolving the crisis. It symbolized Riverside's commitment to addressing the root causes of violence rather than simply responding to its symptoms. The Crisis Intervention Center would offer counseling services, job placement assistance, family mediation, and other support systems designed to help people navigate life's challenges before they reach the breaking point. The afternoon brought a simulation exercise where advanced students practiced negotiating with actors portraying various types of crisis situations. Rachel observed from the control room, noting how each student approached the psychological challenges differently while applying the fundamental principles she had helped develop. Some showed natural empathy but struggled with maintaining professional boundaries, while others demonstrated strong tactical awareness but had difficulty establishing emotional connections with the role-playing subjects. The goal was to help each student find their own balance between compassion and control, understanding that successful negotiation required both technical skill and authentic human concern. One particular student caught Rachel's attention, a young police officer named Marcus Thompson, whose background included military service in Afghanistan and a recent divorce that had left him struggling with depression and anger management issues. His approach to the simulation was aggressive and impatient, focused on achieving compliance rather than understanding the underlying psychological dynamics driving the crisis. Rachel recognized something of Tommy Rodriguez in the young officer's demeanor, not the capacity for violence, but the same feeling of powerlessness and frustration that could lead someone to make devastating choices if left unaddressed. After the simulation, Rachel requested a private meeting with Marcus, using the same gentle but direct approach that had served her well in countless crisis situations. She didn't lecture him about proper technique or criticize his performance, but instead asked about his own experiences with stress and loss, helping him understand how his personal struggles might be affecting his professional judgment. The conversation lasted over an hour, covering everything from his military service to his custody battle, to his fears about his ability to be an effective police officer while dealing with his own emotional challenges. Marcus broke down during the conversation, admitting that he had considered suicide several months earlier, and that he sometimes felt the same rage and hopelessness that drove people to commit violent acts. Rachel listened without judgment, recognizing that his honesty represented the first step toward healing and professional growth. She shared some of her own struggles with the emotional toll of crisis work, the nightmares that had followed particularly difficult cases, and the importance of seeking help before personal problems affected professional performance. The discussion led to Marcus enrolling in the Institute's peer counseling program, where experienced negotiators worked with newer officers to address the psychological challenges of crisis work. Rachel had established the program 5 years earlier after recognizing that many law enforcement officers were reluctant to seek traditional mental health services due to concerns about professional consequences. The peer counseling model allowed officers to receive support from colleagues who understood the unique stresses of police work while maintaining confidentiality and avoiding potential career impacts. Evening found Rachel in her apartment near the Institute, reading the latest research on crisis psychology while preparing for the next day's classes. Her living space was modest but comfortable, decorated with photos from successful negotiations, letters from grateful families, and artwork created by children who had been saved by her techniques, applied in various situations around the world. The walls told the story of a career dedicated to proving that violence was rarely the only option, that even in the most desperate circumstances, communication and empathy could open pathways to peaceful resolution. A framed letter from the White House held a place of honor on her desk, thanking her for her service to the nation and acknowledging the lives saved through the training programs she had developed. 3 different presidents had recognized her work, but Rachel took more pride in the handwritten notes from police officers who had used her techniques to talk suicidal teenagers off bridges, from teachers who had applied her communication strategies to prevent school violence, and from ordinary citizens who had learned to listen with empathy when dealing with people in crisis. The phone rang as Rachel was preparing for bed, bringing news that would test everything she had learned over the past 25 years. A hostage situation was developing at a high school graduation ceremony in suburban Maryland, with an armed individual holding approximately 800 people in the school gymnasium. The FBI was requesting her immediate assistance as a consultant. Recognizing that the situation bore similarities to Lincoln Elementary and might benefit from her specialized expertise, Rachel felt the familiar mixture of adrenaline and dread that accompanied such calls, knowing that despite all her experience and training, each crisis presented unique challenges that could result in tragedy despite everyone's best efforts. She packed her emergency kit, which included communication equipment, psychological assessment materials, and personal items that helped her maintain emotional balance during extended negotiations. The drive to Maryland would take 3 hours, time she would use to review the preliminary intelligence and prepare mentally for what might be another career-defining moment. The graduation ceremony had been proceeding normally when the gunman entered through a side door, apparently targeting someone specific among the graduates or their families. Initial reports suggested that he was a former student who had been expelled several years earlier for threatening behavior, but specific details remained unclear as first responders worked to establish communication and assess the threat level. The number of potential hostages was staggering, representing one of the largest such incidents in recent memory and creating tactical challenges that would require careful coordination between multiple agencies. Rachel arrived at the scene to find a massive law enforcement presence that dwarfed even the response to Lincoln Elementary, with federal agents, state police, local officers, and specialized units from multiple jurisdictions working together to contain the situation. The incident commander briefed her on the limited intelligence they had gathered, including the fact that the gunman had fired several shots but appeared to be negotiating rather than immediately attempting to harm hostages. This behavior pattern suggested someone who wanted to be heard rather than someone committed to mass casualties, creating an opportunity for the kind of psychological intervention Rachel had pioneered. The first phone contact with the gunman revealed a 19-year-old named Brian Walsh, whose life had followed a tragically familiar pattern of academic failure, social isolation, and growing resentment toward classmates he perceived as having advantages he had been denied. His voice carried the same desperate edge Rachel had heard in Tommy Rodriguez 25 years earlier, the sound of someone who felt invisible and powerless, seeking recognition through violence because no other avenue seemed available to him. Rachel began the delicate process of establishing rapport with Brian, drawing on everything she had learned from hundreds of previous negotiations while adapting her approach to the specific psychological dynamics of a young man whose worldview had been shaped by social media, video games, and a culture that often glorified violence as a solution to personal problems. The conversation revealed a complex individual who was simultaneously sophisticated in his understanding of media manipulation and remarkably naive about the long-term consequences of his actions. The negotiation continued for 6 hours, with Rachel gradually building trust and understanding while tactical teams positioned themselves for potential intervention if communication failed. Brian's demands were similar to Tommy's in their fundamental impossibility, focusing on recognition, respect, and revenge against people he felt had wronged him. But unlike Tommy, Brian had grown up in an era of school shootings and active shooter protocols, making him more tactically aware and potentially more dangerous to the large number of people trapped in the gymnasium. The breakthrough came when Rachel shifted the conversation away from Brian's grievances and toward his future, asking him to imagine how his younger sister would feel when she learned about his actions. The mention of his sister triggered an emotional response that revealed the depth of Brian's isolation and his genuine love for the one family member who still believed in him. Rachel carefully explored this relationship, helping Brian understand that his actions would destroy not just his own life, but also the life of someone who looked up to him and needed him to be better than his worst impulses. As dawn approached, Brian Walsh made the same choice Tommy Rodriguez had made a quarter-century earlier, walking out of the gymnasium with his hands raised and surrendering peacefully to the officers who had surrounded the building. 800 people were safely reunited with their families. Graduation ceremonies across the country implemented enhanced security measures, and Rachel Martinez added another successful negotiation to a career that had become synonymous with the power of empathy to overcome violence. The media coverage of the Maryland incident inevitably compared it to Lincoln Elementary, noting how Rachel's techniques had evolved and adapted to address new forms of crisis while maintaining the fundamental principle that every person in crisis deserved to be heard and understood before being judged or punished. The comparison highlighted how much had changed in the field of crisis negotiation over the past 25 years, with Rachel's empathy-based approach becoming standard training for law enforcement agencies worldwide. Brian Walsh was ultimately sentenced to 15 years in prison for his actions, but unlike many similar cases, his story didn't end with incarceration. The psychological evaluation and treatment he received were based on protocols Rachel had helped develop, focusing on addressing the underlying mental health issues and social isolation that had contributed to his violent behavior. His sister visited him regularly throughout his imprisonment, maintaining the family connection that had ultimately motivated his decision to surrender peacefully. Rachel returned to the Institute with renewed appreciation for how far the field had come since that first crisis in Riverside, but also with sobering awareness of how much work remained to be done. Each successful negotiation prevented tragedy for the people directly involved, but it also provided data and experience that could be used to develop better prevention programs, more effective intervention strategies, and deeper understanding of the psychological factors that drove people to consider violence as a solution to their problems. The 25th anniversary commemoration in Riverside drew attendees from around the world, including law enforcement officials, mental health professionals, government leaders, and survivors of various crisis incidents who had been helped by techniques pioneered at Lincoln Elementary. The Crisis Intervention Center was dedicated with speeches from community leaders, federal officials, and Emily Rodriguez, who spoke movingly about forgiveness, redemption, and the importance of addressing mental health issues before they escalated into violence. Rachel's speech at the dedication focused not on her own role in resolving the original crisis, but on the community's response in the years that followed. Riverside had chosen to honor the memory of that frightening day by building something positive rather than simply installing security measures and trying to forget what had happened. The Crisis Intervention Center represented a commitment to helping people before they reached the breaking point, addressing problems at their source rather than simply responding to their symptoms. The Memorial Garden at Lincoln Elementary School had grown over the years into a place of reflection and healing, with paths winding through plantings that bloomed in different seasons to represent the ongoing nature of recovery and growth. A small plaque near the entrance quoted words Rachel had spoken during her first interview after the crisis: "Everyone deserves to be heard, especially those whose pain has made them dangerous to themselves and others." Rachel's retirement from active crisis negotiation came 5 years later, at the age of 57, but her influence on the field continued through the Institute, the training program she had developed, and the thousands of law enforcement officers who had learned her techniques. Her final case involved talking a despondent farmer out of a planned attack on a rural courthouse, using the same patient empathy that had characterized her entire career to help one more person step back from violence and choose life instead. The legacy of the Lincoln Elementary hostage crisis extended far beyond any single individual or incident. influencing everything from police training curricula to mental health policy to school security protocols. The approach Rachel had pioneered proved that violence prevention was more effective than violence response, that understanding was more powerful than intimidation, and that every person in crisis retained some capacity for making better choices, if someone was willing to help them find alternatives to destruction. Tommy Rodriguez's story became part of that legacy, remembered not as a cautionary tale about the dangers of mental illness, but as an example of how redemption remained possible, even after the worst mistakes. His life after prison demonstrated that people could change, that second chances could lead to meaningful contributions to society, and that the most broken individuals could find purpose in helping others avoid their path to desperation. Emily Rodriguez completed her doctoral studies and established a research program focused on preventing family violence through early intervention and support services. Her work was funded in part by grants from the Tommy Rodriguez Memorial Fund, creating a direct connection between her father's moment of crisis and her life's work, helping other families navigate their difficulties before they reached similar breaking points. Rachel Martinez spent her retirement years writing, teaching, and consulting on crisis intervention strategies, but she never forgot the afternoon when she had sat in a police car listening to a desperate man describe his love for his daughter, while 500 people waited to learn whether they would live or die. That moment had taught her that courage wasn't the absence of fear, but the willingness to connect with someone else's humanity even when they had chosen to embrace violence as their only option. The final entry in Rachel's professional journal, written on the day of her retirement, reflected on the thousands of people whose lives had been saved by choosing communication over conflict, empathy over force, and hope over despair. She wrote about the privilege of serving as a bridge between law enforcement and mental health, between crisis and resolution, between violence and peace. But most importantly, she wrote about the lesson she had learned from Tommy Rodriguez and carried with her through every subsequent negotiation, that even in the darkest moments, when all hope seemed lost and violence appeared inevitable, there remained the possibility that one person's willingness to listen could change everything. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.